Welcome to the lab. This is the Big Scientist channel where we explore the why so you know how. In honor of Black History Month, we are baking up delicious treats that are popular in the African American community and that I personally grew up with. Today, we are exploring the why behind decadent, creamy, flavorful bread pudding so you know how to whip one up in your own kitchen. So make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell to stay up to date on all delicious science. Now let's get into it. So today we're going to go ahead and hit the ground running with some delicious science. So first thing, for bread puddings, you always want to use stale bread. And as you can see, this is a fresh loaf of brioche bread that I'm using. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to mimic staling this bread. But first, let's talk about why we want to use stale bread. So when bread stales, it goes through a process called starch retrogradation. And this is a process where the starch molecules recrystallize and they release water and they recrystallize and get harder, which is why your bread, when it's stale, it's hard, it's crispy, it's lost its water. This happens when the gelatinized starch molecule called amylose, it releases water from the gel structure. The water is released as it ages. The water releases, and the starch molecule starts to contract and recrystallize. It restructures and recrystallizes, and that creates a little hard structure. So when you look at your bread, the structure that it has is made up of gelatinized starch molecules. And as they lose water as they age, as they age, no matter what you do, bread's always going to naturally stale. And as it ages, like water's lost as it's in the air, as it's sitting out. The older it gets, it starts to lose its water, and the little structure you see in the bread, it starts to get harder and firmer because of that water loss. Now this is not irreversible. It's reversible to an extent, and that's kind of what we're going to do when we make our bread pudding. The extent to which it's reversible is by using heat. So if you heat up stale bread to about 302 degrees Fahrenheit or around 150 degrees Celsius, you can introduce a little bit of water from the air in and get it to soften up a little bit, but this is not a permanent process. What I'm going to do here is I've cut up my bread and I'm putting it on a tray because my bread is fresh. In order to stale it a little bit more, I'm going to use cold air. So cold air is drying. It's very dry. There's no moisture. Usually there's not a lot of moisture in cold air. So I cut it up and I'm going to go ahead and put it in the refrigerator, and this is actually going to help draw out the moisture so we can mimic staling. You can also do this after you've let it dry out a little bit in the refrigerator, by putting it in the oven to heat it up. I know we just said that heating it up adds in moisture, but heating it at a low temperature, we can actually kind of draw out a little bit more moisture by kind of toasting it in a sense. But first, let's go ahead and stick it in the fridge and let it cool off and get some of that water out. So it's best to leave your bread in the fridge at least overnight, if not for a few days. That'll really dry it out very well. So we talked about one way to reverse starch retrogradation was by applying a little bit of heat. Well, another way is actually to apply a little bit of liquid, and that's what we're going to do with our bread pudding. It's essentially applying heat and liquid to rehydrate our bread with a flavoring, kind of. And as you can see, I just pulled my bread out the fridge, and it is nice and harder. As you can see, I can push them together, and they're not smushy, really. They're pretty hard, and that's what we want. It's stale. So now we've pretty much staled our bread pretty quickly. So now we can go ahead and start with our actual bread pudding assembly, which brings us to a little bit more science, custard science. Now, if you haven't already, please go ahead and check out our previous custard video, our cheesecake video. It really goes into great detail about the basic custard and what a custard is and how it's used. And also our egg video, our scrambled egg video, goes into great detail about eggs. Because as you might know from our previous videos, a custard is primarily made up of eggs, milk, and sugar, with eggs being the star. So the egg science is actually what's really important here. And right now I'm just mixing together my cinnamon and nutmeg with my milk and half to get that ready to go for making our custard. Now this custard is a little bit different than what you've seen in our cheesecake video. This custard it's egg based, as most custards are, and we're also adding our milk, which is our half and half, and our milk and our half and half, and then sugars. We're gonna be adding brown and white sugar to this. So the importance of a custard is with the eggs, is that the eggs give the custard its structure. So if you've seen our egg science video with our scrambled egg video, you'll know that eggs have egg proteins in eggs. They denature as they heat. And when they denature, they unwind. Denaturing is unwinding of the proteins. So egg proteins are naturally very twisted together and they're very compact molecules. But when they're heated, as in cooking on a stove or even in the oven, as such we're going to do here, they unwind. And so they become long chains and they form like a mesh web that becomes very structurally sound. But if you are to heat them too quickly, or you don't add in certain inhibitors, then they become very rubbery. Think like hard-boiled egg, like they become very rubbery, like a hard-boiled egg almost. And that's not a good taste or a good texture in a lot of baked goods such as cheesecakes and bread puddings. So the importance of heating slowly and evenly across the whole dish will help you to make sure that your eggs will arrange themselves in a web that is a lot softer and a lot more velvety to the taste and texture to your dessert. So for our bread pudding, what we want our stale bread to effectively absorb some of this custard that we're making, so that the egg proteins can then expand or unwind and give that structure to our bread that it's lost because of the staling, the structure that's lost, and give it a nice custardy kind of texture. So our bread's turning into essentially a pudding, if you will. It's not bread-like anymore. Now it's going to be more custardy, to say in any other way. And so the egg science is the important thing here. That's what's going to give our bread pudding its structure, going to give our bread pudding its nice mouthfeel. It's going to give it its flavor. So here I just added all of my ingredients to the blender. I blended up my eggs. You want to do the eggs first so that they can start they can be scrambled. And then you want to slowly pour in your milk mixture, and just make sure everything is mixed completely combined, and then you can go ahead and start pouring it into your bread pudding. So here, now we're going to go ahead and get our baking dish. Now please do not do what I just did and forget to spray your baking dish. This becomes almost impossible to get out of the dish once it's been baked, so please make sure you grease your pan. I forgot to, but make sure you grease your pan. So here I'm just adding in all the staled bread that we staled to the pan, and then you want to add in any mix-ins. Now you can use anything from fruits to chocolates, candies, anything really you can think of, you can add into your bread pudding. I love a chocolate in my bread pudding, so that's what I'm doing. I chopped up a dark chocolate bar, and I'm just gonna put that in. And you can mix it through. You can just lay it on top, however you like to do it. I like mine throughout, and I also like some on top. So I'm gonna mix it up, and then I'm also gonna add a little bit more on top after we add in our custard. So once the bread has been arranged and the mix-ins are in, you can go ahead and start adding your custard. And you want to pour this evenly across the whole dish. You don't want it drowning, but you want to make sure that it's all covered. You want to make sure all the bread has been covered with the custard. And what I like to do is I like to go slowly just to make sure that everything's in there. But you don't pour it all in at once, because sometimes you might not need the entire batch of custard. And if you add too much custard, it can end up being too liquidy, like loose. And we want a firm bread pudding. So go ahead and add it, and don't mix. You don't want to mix, you want to press. You want to press the bread down into the custard so that it helps to absorb it. You don't really want to like take your spatula and kind of actually mix the bread around. You just want to press it down. So just press it in, and then keep pouring more custard on until you feel that there's enough that your bread can, because also remember, your bread's going to soak this up. So you don't want too little, but you don't want too much. You just want to make sure it's enough for the bread to absorb and cook and not be liquidy without it being too dry. So again, you just want to press the bread down. You don't want to mix it, just to make sure that it's all in there and soaking up all that good custard. And what you want to do is you don't want to bake this right away, because you need because the bread is stale. It's all of its moisture has been pretty much removed. We want to make sure it has time to reabsorb that moisture and get softer and absorb that custard, so that custard can get in there, and when it cooks, it can create the structure we want inside of our bread pudding. So in order to do that, we're going to let this sit, and you can let this sit on the counter for just about like 2 to 3 hours, or if you're going to cook it same day. Or if this is something you're preparing ahead, and say you want to make it for breakfast the next morning or brunch or whatever, you can go ahead and cover this and put it in the fridge, and it'll sit and absorb slowly in the fridge overnight, and absorb all that custard. So either way, you just want to make sure you allow this to set and rest for a little bit, so that the bread can really rehydrate and get all that custard in there, because the custard is really what's gonna do the magic here. And if it's not absorbed into the bread, it's not gonna give us the texture we want. So I let this sit for about 2 to 3 hours, and as you can see, the bread looks a lot more full, because it's absorbed a lot of that custard. And I'll just go ahead and show you really quick kind of a side view of what it looks like. Well, after I'm going to add a little bit more, because there's a few areas that I felt needed a little bit more help, so I added a little bit more custard around. But after that, we can take a side view and see what it really looks like, what the custard has absorbed mostly into the bread. And also adding, like I mentioned, I like to have a lot of chocolate in mine, so I'm adding a little bit more chocolate on top. And again, you can have other add-ins like fruit or whatever, and you can add that however you want. So I really wanted to get a good close-up so you can see what it looks like. And as you can see, the custard isn't completely absorbed, like it's not bone dry, like the bread hasn't just sucked it all up. That you can still see custard in there peeking through, but it's not overly saturated. It's not swimming in the custard, as you can see. So this is okay, because the custard, like I mentioned, how the egg proteins will denature and create that web, they will get solid, they will solidify. So they will create like a nice, almost like if you want to think of like an omelet, how an omelet kind of holds things together. That's kind of the network we're going to have with the custard that hasn't fully been absorbed by the bread. But because the bread is mostly absorbed with the custard, the bread is going to be stuck in that matrix of egg protein web, and that's exactly what we want. So now we can go ahead and bake this. So we want to bake this low and slow. Like I mentioned, this is a custard, so we don't want to curdle the eggs, and we don't want to cook the eggs so fast that they really solidify like a hard-boiled egg. We want slow and steady. So we're gonna cook this at 325 for about 45 minutes to an hour. And we're gonna cook it slowly. We just wanna make sure it's fully set and that it's ready to go. So I've cooked mine for about an hour at 325, and let's see how it looks. So here it is, our final product, a delicious, creamy, velvety, chocolatey, in this case, bread pudding. And I'm gonna go ahead and take a scoop out, and we're gonna plate this up so we can really see what our custard did to this staled bread. So again, please make sure you grease your pan, unlike me. But let's go ahead and take a slice out and see what it looks like. So as you can see, the custard really helps to give this structure. It's not just a bunch of pieces of bread. It's a cohesive kind of dish, if you will. They're all the bread is like together, like almost like a cake, if you will, and it's nice. You can slice it, and it's nice. Has a nice little mouthfeel to it. So that's your bread pudding. And I like to drizzle mine with caramel sauce. You can make a vanilla sauce to put on top, but if you haven't already, check out our caramel sauce video for this delicious salted caramel sauce. It was delicious on this bread pudding. And until next time, happy baking.